Good morning, everyone. Time to get started, so come on in and find you a place. Hope everyone had a great weekend. Bit of excitement out there. I love it. I haven't heard the buzzer yet. Good morning, everyone. What a weekend. Must have been a lot happening. There's a lot of talk going on this morning. That's wonderful. Anybody notice that it's raining and not snowing? Yeah. Feels good out there, doesn't it? Yeah, it's early in the season, it's raining, and the reservoirs need it, the aquifers need it, the ground needs it. Come June, it'll burn off. How's everybody doing this morning? All right, love it. If you remember, last week we started talking about the story of Joseph being sold to Potiphar. And so to kind of recap, you might recall that in chapter 38, we read the story about Judah and Tamar. And then we found out in verse 39 that meanwhile Joseph is sold to Potiphar. One thing I wanted to point out and remind you that while 38 and 39, 38 precedes 39, these two events, Judah and Tamar and Joseph being sold to Egypt, are happening at the same time. You may recall that Judah is has gone to visit a friend, Hira. During that time span, he found a wife, had 3 sons. And the story with Tamar was happening, and at the same time, Joseph has been sold into Egypt. So as you go through this, it's not one event follows the other event, in this case 38 following 39 in the chronological order. It's that these two events are happening at the same time. And so you can, and the timeline is separate for a period of time, for a period of years, until they come back together when we'll see in a few chapters where the brothers come down to Egypt to buy grain because of the famine that's going in the land. So it's kind of, I wanted to point that out so you can see that while these events are happening at 2 different locations, they're going on at the same time. Now we got down to, we started looking at the story of Potiphar's wife and how she was attracted to Joseph. And so let's begin that again so that we can get the full story this time. You know how when you watch a series of things, they go back and tell you what happened last week, and it's kind of like, well, you just saw it last week, so why do they re-show it again? Well, you know, a lot has happened in your life since a week ago, so I'm just going to refresh your memory so that we can get back into the story of this life that's of Joseph and the character that he is. This is also can be reviewed as a character study because he is quite an individual, quite the individual that God is saw fit to give us information about. Let us pray. Our Father in heaven, we're so thankful for this week, this past week, this week that's coming before us. We're grateful for the rain that is falling upon the land. We're so grateful for the blessings you give us in this country. We know that as this rain nourishes this ground, we're going to read a story about an area where rain stopped nourishing the ground and the trials and the challenges it brought to that people of that land. We pray that you'll be with us in our studies, guide, guard, and direct us, that we may always follow your will. In Christ's name we pray. Amen. We're in chapter 39, and we're going to begin about verse 6. Now if you'll recall, Joseph was a well-built and handsome man, according to the New Century Version. After some time, the wife of Joseph's master began to desire Joseph, and one day she said to him, "Have sexual relations with me." Now, Joseph is a younger man at this point. He's probably in his 20s. And so he's being tempted with something that, if you listen to the world, it's something that you can't say no to, especially if you're a young man. But Joseph refused and said to her, "My master trusts me with everything in his house. He has put me in charge of everything he owns. There is no one in his house greater than I, and he has not kept anything from me except you, because you are his wife. How can I do such an evil thing? It is sin against God." The woman talked to Joseph every day, but he refused to have relations with her or even spend time with her. So God gives us a way out, fellas. It's a challenge, isn't it? But God gives us a good way out. But even when you do the right thing, one day Joseph went into the house to do his work as usual, and was the only man in the house at that time. His master's wife grabbed his coat and said to him, "Come and have relations with me." But Joseph left his coat in her hand and ran out of the house. Again, he did the right thing. When she saw that Joseph had left his coat in her hands and had run out, she called to the servants in her house and said, "Look, this Hebrew slave was brought here to shame us. He came in and tried to have relations with me. I screamed. My scream scared him, and he ran away, and he left his coat with me." She kept his coat until her husband came home. And she told him the same story. She said, "The Hebrew slave you brought here came in to shame me. When he came near me, I screamed. He ran away, but he left his coat." So you see, Potiphar's wife, not only does she lie, but she blames her husband for bringing that Hebrew slave into the house. Potiphar's wife turned it into a racial issue, putting upon Joseph a character that is not Joseph. She lied about him. You've seen that in politics today. You've seen that probably in your life, others that have been lied about. Well, here, Joseph, a good man, he did the right thing, and still she lied about him. And when Joseph's master heard what his wife said Joseph had done, he became very angry. So Potiphar arrested Joseph and put him into the prison where the king's prisoners were put. And Joseph stayed there in the prison. Joseph went into that house, and there wasn't anybody else in the house to be a witness that would have helped be a witness for him. And so the Joseph's master, you could say what you will about Potiphar, he had his wife's word. His wife's word was all he had to go on with. Those of us who have been married many years, we trust our spouses. And so, the word they say. Well, we're seeing the story in the surrounding context. Potiphar did not. But of course, you can understand from his perspective, what he was told, he felt was true. He thought was true. He had no way of disproving that. And so he became angry with the reported behavior of Joseph and thus arrested him. But the Lord was with Joseph and showed him kindness and caused the prison warden to like Joseph. The prison warden chose Joseph to take care of all the prisoners, and he was responsible for whatever was done in the prison. The warden paid no attention to anything that was in Joseph's care because the Lord was with Joseph and made him successful in everything he did. So when you look at this, the Lord was with Joseph. And so you see, even in the condition he was put into as a slave, he excelled. And when an unfortunate situation happens, he does all the right things, but yet Potiphar's wife lies about it. But the Lord is with Joseph. He showed him kindness and caused the prison warden to like Joseph. Chose Joseph to take care of all the prisoners, and he was responsible for whatever was done in the prison. The warden paid no attention to anything that was in Joseph's care. Now that says a lot for the character of Joseph. Character of Joseph. Joseph gave his father bad reports, or as the King James says, evil reports about his brothers. So he came back and told the truth. That's how I interpret that. He didn't come back and lie about him. He told them the truth of what they were doing. Thus his brothers weren't too happy about that. Potiphar left Joseph in charge of everything he owned and was not concerned about anything except the food he ate. And the warden paid no attention to anything that was in Joseph's care because the Lord was with Joseph and made him successful in everything he did. Here's the character of Joseph demonstrated to us. That even when you do the right thing, sometimes people will lie about you. Daniel experienced that. Many others have experienced that. You may have experienced that in your life. While he was in prison, he met these two individuals, the butler and baker, as referred to in King James. What I like about this picture is Joseph is illustrated there as a rather handsome young man, but he has no shackles on him, whereas the butler and baker, they are shackled there in the prison. And so they are both, all three of these folks are prisoners, except that Joseph is in charge of a group of prisoners and can come and go as he please. In Genesis, the 40th chapter, after these things we talked about as far as him being put in prison, two of the king's officers displeased the king, the man who served wine to the king and the king's baker. The king became angry with his officers who served him wine and his baker. So he put them in prison of the captain of the guard, the same prison where Joseph was kept. The captain of the guard put the two prisoners in Joseph's care, and they stayed in prison for some time. Now, as a kid, I always wondered, what did the baker and the butler do? Did they burn the toast? Was the coffee bad that morning? Was the wine spilled? What did they do to make the king angry? And I guess the answer is, well, they just made him angry and the king put him in prison. But we're not told that part of the story. We're just told that they displeased the king and they were put into prison. And the prison where Joseph was at. So one night, both the king's officers who served him wine and the baker had a dream. Each had his own dream with its own meaning. When Joseph came to them the next morning, he saw they were worried. Now here's another character positive about Joseph. He was concerned about the individuals. Even though they're in prison, he saw that even though they're in prison, they were worried. He asked the king's officers who were with him, "Why do you look so unhappy today?" Now, if I'm in prison, I'm not sure I'd be happy any day. But today, they were unhappy, and Joseph noticed that. The two men answered, "Both have had dreams last night, but no one can explain their meaning to us." So apparently they have had interaction with the other prisoners or someone else in the prison there. And so they haven't been able to understand or receive a meaning for these dreams. So Joseph said to them, "God is the only one who can explain the meaning of dreams. Tell me your dreams." So the man who served wine to the king told Joseph his dream. He said, "I dreamed I saw a vine, and on the vine were 3 branches. I watched the branches bud and blossom, and then the grapes ripened. I was holding the king's cup, so I took grapes and squeezed the juice into the cup, and then I gave it to the king." But then Joseph said, "I will explain the dream to you. The 3 branches stand for 3 days. Before the end of 3 days, the king will free you, and he will allow you to return to your work. You will serve the king his wine just as you did before. But when you are free, remember me, be kind to me, and tell the king about me so I can get out of this prison. I was taken by force from the land of the Hebrews, and I have done nothing here to deserve being put in prison." So you can see Joseph's heart right there. He knows he's done nothing there to be there. He knows he does not deserve this, but yet no matter what his situation, he has been successful. But yet he wants out of this successful situation of being in charge of prisoners in the prison. So it's a pretty good interpretation, wouldn't you agree? Would you like this one? Yeah, sure. And so the second one is told. The baker saw that Joseph's explanation of the dream was good, so he said to him, I also had a dream. I dreamed there were 3 bread baskets on my head. In the top baskets were all kinds of baked food for the king, but the birds were eating his food out of the basket on my head. Joseph answered, I will tell you what the dream means. The 3 baskets stands for 3 days. Sounds good so far, right? Before the end of 3 days, the king will cut off your head. He will hang your body on a pole, and the birds will eat your flesh. Which would you rather be at this moment, the butler or the baker? 3 days on his birthday, the king gave a feast for all his officers. In front of his officers, he released from prison the chief officer who served his wine and the chief baker. The king gave his chief officer who served wine his old position. And once again, he put the king's cup of wine in the king's hand. But the king hanged the baker on a pole. Everything happened just as Joseph had said it would. But the officer who served wine did not remember Joseph. He forgot all about him. So, some time passes by. 2 years later, it says, the king dreamed he was standing on the bank of the Nile River. He saw 7 fat and beautiful cows come up out of the river, and they stood there eating the grass. Now, cows coming out of the river, if they're crossing, it's fine, but this appears to be they came out of the water, as if they were underneath and came back out. So that would be a strange dream, wouldn't it? That would be really strange. Then 7 more cows came out of the river, but they were thin and ugly. They stood beside the 7 beautiful cows on the bank of the Nile. The 7 thin and ugly cows ate the 7 beautiful cows. Then the king woke up. Boy, I sure would. I mean, cows eating cows? That's a bit different, isn't it? I mean, how many people have tended cattle? Have you ever seen a cow eat a cow? Nope. Now we humans do. We enjoy those cows. Filet mignon, that's good. That's good. And so the king slept again and dreamed a second time. In his dream, he saw 7 full and good heads of grain growing on one stalk. After that, 7 more heads of grain sprang up, but they were thin and burned by the hot east wind. The thin heads of grain ate the 7 full and good heads. Then the king woke up again, and he realized it was only a dream. You know, he must have been wondering, what did I have to eat before I went to bed, you know? It's just, this is a weird dream for him. And so the next morning, the king was troubled about these dreams, so he sent for all the magicians and the wise men of Egypt. The king told them his dreams, but no one could explain the meaning to him. Now, it makes you wonder if some of these officers that he called, these magicians and wise men, you know, I wonder if they simply said, well, I can't do it, or I can't tell you what it means, or whether they tried to tell him and the king said, well, that doesn't sound right. But yet they were unable to. And so for some reason, he was still concerned about this. You can imagine why, because this is a disturbing dream. Then the chief officer who served wine to the king said to him, now I remember something I promised to do, but I forgot about it. So here's something he's promised. And Joseph, a wonderful man, is still languishing in prison because this man forgot to do something about it. But now's the opportunity. There was a time when you were angry with the baker and me, and you put us in prison in the house of the captain of the guard. In prison, we each had a dream on the same night, and each dream had a different meaning. A young Hebrew man, a servant of the captain of the guard, was in prison with us. When we told him our dream, He explained their meanings to us. He told each man the meaning of his dream, and the thing happened exactly as he said they would. I was given back my old position, and the baker was hanged. Now, the king probably remembers this because it was on his birthday. You know, it was a special day. He let some prisoners out, hung one of them, gave one back the position. That particular act by the king showed everyone around him that, you know, he meant business when he said to do something. If you cross me, you're going to get in trouble. So, plus it was my birthday, and we're all celebrating. And so the king remembers this. He understands this, so the king called for Joseph. The guards quickly brought him out of the prison, and he shaved, put on clean clothes, and went before the king. Now, this illustrates extremely well the condition that Joseph was in. He was in prison. He was filthy. It wasn't the kind of prisons that you see talked about in our nation today. It was just a filthy condition. And so they cleaned him up before he took him to the king, which is kind of nice of him. You know? So he went to the king. Now he's in good shape. Again, he's a handsome man. He's well dressed now. He's clean. The king said to Joseph, I have had a dream, but no one can explain its meaning to me. I have heard that you can explain a dream when someone tells it to you. Joseph answered, I love this answer Joseph gives to the king. Joseph answered the king, I am not able to explain the meaning of dreams. But God will do this for the king. Joseph was, maybe the king might have been taken back a little bit. Well, but I was told you tell meanings of dreams, but you're saying you can't tell meanings of dreams. But yet every time he's worked with this, this position where he's telling dreams, he says, but God will do this for the king. Then the king said to Joseph, in my dream, I was standing on the bank of the Nile River. I saw 7 fat and beautiful cows come up out of the river and ate the grass. Then I saw 7 more cows come out of the river that were thin and lean and ugly, the worst looking cows I have seen in all of Egypt. Now, he's the king. He should know. The worst looking cows he's ever seen. And these thin and ugly cows ate the first 7 cows. But after they had eaten the 7 cows, no one could tell they had eaten them. They looked just as thin and ugly as they did in the beginning. Then I woke up. The king says, I had another dream. I saw 7 full and good heads of grain growing on one stalk. Then 7 more heads of grain sprang up after them, but these heads were thin and ugly and were burned by the hot east wind. Then the thin heads ate the 7 good heads. I told this dream to the magicians, but no one could explain its meaning to me. I can just imagine the situation here. King is sitting in his royal position. I'm sure he has his entourage around him. People are listening to him. The guards have brought Joseph in. He's standing there before this king, and people are listening. What's he going to say? The guards maybe are thinking, I may have to do something with this fellow if he doesn't please the king. Maybe he's going through what he's going to do next. The people surrounding, man, what's this guy going to say? Can you imagine the tension in that royal room as Joseph and the king look at each other? The king is expecting some words of wisdom to explain this dream. And Joseph said to the king, both of these dreams mean the same thing. God is telling you what he is about to do. The 7 good cows stand for 7 years, and the 7 good heads of grain stand for 7 years. Both dreams mean the same thing. The 7 thin and ugly cows stand for 7 years, and the 7 thin heads of grain burned by the hot east wind stand for 7 years of hunger. This will happen as I told you. God is showing the king what he is about to do. You will have 7 years of good crops and plenty to eat in all the land of Egypt. But after those 7 years, there will come 7 years of hunger. And all the food that grew in the land of Egypt will be forgotten. The time of hunger will eat up the land, People forget what it was like to have plenty of food because the hunger that follows will be so great. You had two dreams, which mean the same thing. This shows that God has firmly decided that this will happen, and he will make it happen soon. Now, is this a good or bad telling explanation of the dreams? It's both. Yeah, King, I have some good news and I have some bad news. Which do you want first? And so he interprets it. And so the king is sitting there with this information. What's the king going to do? I mean, you know the rest of the story anyways, but just kind of back off from the rest of the story for a moment and put yourself in the position of that king. Here you've been told there's a calamity coming. Now, it's 7 years off, but there's a calamity coming. The nation in that area is going to be struck with a famine that people will forget what food is. Forget about food. Alex. Say that one more time. I didn't hear y'all. Telling the good news first softens the bad news. Yes, normally. But you know the joke is, okay, give me the bad news. Okay, if that was bad news, what's good news? You know, so it's an interesting conundrum for that king right now. Joseph, think about this for a moment. Joseph has been pulled out of prison. He's been there a while. Okay, he comes up and says this stuff, that a calamity is coming in 7 years. So the king has to make a choice. And so Joseph continues in verse 33. So let the king choose a man who is very wise and understanding and set him over the land of Egypt. And let the king also appoint officers over the land who should take 1/5 of all the food that is grown during the 7 good years. They should gather all the food that is produced during the good years that are coming, and under the king's authority they should store the grains in the cities and guard it. That food should be saved to use during the 7 years of hunger that will come on the land of Egypt. Then the people in Egypt will not die during the 7 years of hunger. Not only does Joseph come to him with an interpretation, both good and bad, he doesn't leave it there. He gives him a solution. He gives him advice. And I would suggest that based on what Joseph has said, that only God can explain a dream, that God is providing this wisdom to Joseph to tell the king. Seems pretty rational, doesn't it? Joseph explained the problem and gave a solution. Something that we can take from this in our lives, you know, when you're trying to solve a problem either at work or in your own life or helping somebody else. Don't just, hey, that's broke. Good luck. And walk away. If you can provide a solution, you should. You know, if you bring a problem to someone, your boss or something, you should also bring with it at least a recommended solution. Now, the king has a choice here. He's been given the interpretation and a recommended way ahead with this interpretation of this dream, this powerful dream. And in verse 37, this seemed like a very good idea to the king, and all his officers agreed. So here he's in that royal space. He's surrounded by all his ruling, the people who rule with him. They heard this, and they all agreed. Now, I don't know if it was, well, the king thought it was a good idea, and everybody said yes. That may have had something to do with it. And the king asked them, can we find a better man than Joseph to take this job? God's Spirit is truly with him. The king saw something in Joseph. And so he says to everybody around him, can we find a better person? Now, I'm not sure if all these folks are yes king, yes men, but yet they agreed with him. They were supportive of his decision. And so the king said to Joseph, God has shown you all this. There is no one as wise and understanding as you are. So I will put you in charge of my palace. All the people will obey your orders, and only I will be greater than you. Now that's quite a promotion, don't you think? He's gone from being the guard's servant and in charge of a section of the prison to where the warden doesn't even think about it. When he was with Potiphar, he was in charge of all his house, to where Potiphar only worried about his food. When he was at home with his father, he told his father all about what his brothers were doing. An honest young man. And here he's been promoted from that dirty environment that he was working in to being second in the land of Egypt. What a promotion. Then the king said to Joseph, "Look, I have put you in charge of all the land of Egypt." Let's see. Let me get up to here. I really like this little picture that I found drawing. You see on there that he's a rather attractive fella. Yeah, and so the king, will read here shortly, has a procession throughout the city and declaring who he is. Then the king said to Joseph, "Look, I have put you in charge of all the land of Egypt." Then the king took off from his own finger his ring and the royal seal on it and put it on Joseph's finger. He gave Joseph fine linen clothes to wear. He put a gold chain around Joseph's neck. The king had Joseph ride in the second royal chariot, and people walked ahead of his chariot calling, "Bow down." By doing these things, the king put Joseph in charge of all of Egypt. The king said to him, "I am the king. And I say that no one in all the land of Egypt may lift a hand or a foot without your permission." The king gave Joseph the name, and you can read it in your translation, but it starts with a Z, and the second part of it has a capital P. I called him Zulu Papa. He also gave Joseph a wife named Asenath, who was the daughter of Potiphar, priest of On. So Joseph traveled through all the land of Egypt. What a change. What a change. Joseph was 30 years old when he began serving the king of Egypt. And he left the king's court and traveled through all the land of Egypt. He could go anywhere he wanted now. He was no longer a prisoner. He was no longer a slave. Well, but he worked for the king now. He was a different type of servant. He was a ruling individual, and only the king was greater than he. During the 7 good years, the crops in the land grew well, and Joseph gathered all the food produced in Egypt during those 7 years of good crops and stored the food in the cities. In every city, he stored grain that had been grown in the fields around the city. Joseph stored much grain, as much as the sand of the seashore, so much that he could not measure it. That's a lot of grain. Can you imagine being the producer, the farmer, going out, you plant everything and it just grows? Any farmers here? Anybody do any farming? Did the plants always grow every year and produce as much as possible? No. Some years was good, some years not so good. And so this must have been just a bountiful season for these people. They were just like living a dream. My crops grow every time I put them in the ground. Joseph's wife was the daughter of Potiphar, the priest of On. Before the years of hunger came, Joseph and Asenath had 2 sons. Joseph named the first son Manasseh and said, "God has made me forget all my troubles I have had and all my father's family." Joseph named the second son Ephraim and said, "God has given me children in the land of my troubles." His life has changed. He's not, the situation that he found himself when he was younger has changed dramatically. I don't know if you can relate to the situation that he's in, from rags to riches, if you will, is a way of saying it. But Joseph, he was put to a lot of tests that many of us have not been, but have had similar. He was sold by his brothers into slavery. And yet, at this point in the story, he's second to the king in Egypt. And that's quite the change. And he did that because he refused to follow or refused to be tempted by Potiphar's wife. He refused to be a normal prisoner, if you will. He was a modeled prisoner, if you can put it that way. He was given responsibility. He was successful. The 7 years of good crops came to an end in the land of Egypt. Then the 7 years of hunger began, just as Joseph had said. And in all the lands, people had nothing to eat, but in Egypt there was food. The time of hunger became terrible in all of Egypt, and the people cried to the king for food. He said to all the Egyptians, "Go to Joseph and do whatever he tells you." The hunger was everywhere. In that part of the world, that is, the hunger was everywhere in that part of the world. And Joseph opened the storehouses and sold grain to the people of Egypt because the time of hunger became terrible in Egypt. And all the people in that part of the world came to Joseph in Egypt to buy grain because the hunger was terrible everywhere in that part of the world. And you look at Genesis 42. I want to move ahead just for a second. The extent of the famine. I mean, in today's terms, we fly across the world in a matter of hours. But in that time, airlines had not been invented yet. And travel was by foot or maybe by riding some animal or a chariot or something like that. And that's a lot of distance to cover when walking. And so the area that had the famine going on was just tremendous. But yet Egypt had stored up all this grain, all this food, and so rumor gets out. You're hungry, you start asking around, where's the nearest food source? And so the word got out that Egypt had food. And so people made plans to go and purchase food from Egypt. And so when you look at chapter 42, Jacob learned, now we're back to where this timeline between his separation from his family is going to come back together here shortly. Jacob learned that there was grain in Egypt. So he said to his sons, "Why are you sitting here looking at one another?" You just imagine that tone of voice, "I have heard there is grain in Egypt. Go down there and buy grain for us to eat, so that we will live and not die." So 10 of Joseph's brothers went down to buy grain from Egypt. But Jacob did not send Benjamin, Joseph's brother, with them because he was afraid that something terrible might happen to him. And you can understand that fear. Why, his other son Joseph was killed by wild beasts. So you can understand that fear. Along with many other people, the sons of Israel went to Egypt to buy grain because the people in the land of Canaan were also hungry. So it wasn't just Jacob's brothers that went down there by themselves. They reached out to the neighbors, or the neighbors may have said, "Hey, we hear you're going. Can we go with you?" But there was a group of people that began to go south. Now, Joseph was governor over Egypt. He was the one who sold the grain to people who came to buy it. So Joseph's brothers came to him and bowed face down on the ground before him. When Joseph saw his brothers, he knew who they were. But he acted as if he didn't know them. He asked unkindly, "Where do you come from?" Came true. If you go back to Genesis 37, 5-9, you'll see where he told his brothers that. And they riled against him. They were upset about that dream. "Who do you think you are, you dreamer?" And they did. the dream came true. They answered, "We have come from the land of Canaan to buy food." Jesus knew they were his brothers, but they did not know who he was. And Joseph remembered his dreams about his brothers bowing to him. He said to them, "You are spies. You came to learn where the nation is weak." But his brothers said to him, "No, my master, we come as your servants just to buy food. We are all sons of the same father. We are honest men, not spies." They exaggerate a little bit, don't they? They are honest men. When Joseph said to them, "No, you have come to learn where this nation is weak," they said, "We are 10 of 12 brothers, sons of the same father, and we live in the land of Canaan. Our youngest brother is there with our father right now, and our other brother is gone." But Joseph said to them, "I can see I was right. You are spies. But I will give you a way to prove you are telling the truth. As surely as the king lives, you will not leave this place until your youngest brother comes here. One of you must go and get your brother. The rest of you will stay here in prison. We will see if you are telling the truth. If not, as surely as the king lives, you are spies." Then Joseph put them all in prison for 3 days. On the third day, Joseph said to them, "I am a God-fearing man. Do this, and I will let you live. If you are honest men, let one of your brothers stay here in prison while the rest of you go and carry grain back to feed your hungry families. Then bring your youngest brother here to me. If you do this, I will know you are telling the truth. You will not die." The brothers agreed to this. They said to each other, "We are being punished for what we did to our brother. We saw his trouble, and he begged us to save him. But we refused to listen. That is why we are in this trouble now." You think? What a situation. And what I find interesting, then Reuben said, "I told you not to harm the boy." And we start pointing fingers again, as siblings do. "But you refused to listen to me. So now we are being punished for what we did to him." When Joseph talked to his brothers, I like this part. When Joseph talked to his brothers, he used an interpreter. So they did not know that Joseph understood what they were saying. So he's standing there listening to them saying, he's speaking to them through an interpreter, totally understanding what they're saying. And then Joseph left them and cried. Can you imagine the emotion that's going through Joseph at this moment as this man who is second to the king in Egypt sees his family again, his brothers, the brothers who sold him, and the regret that they're expressing in front of him of what they did. And yet, he's not willing at this point at least to identify who he is to them. But he goes away and cries. After a short time, he went back and spoke to them. He took Simeon and tied him up while the other brothers watched. Joseph told his servants to fill his brothers' bags with grain and to put the money the brothers had paid for the grain back in their bags. The servants were also to give them what they would need for their trip back home, and the servants did this. We're going to stop here at this point. We'll pick up next week. But can you imagine the emotion that's going through the brothers? Because they came to buy grain, and now they're in prison. They've got to go back and bring their youngest brother down, who they know their father doesn't want to turn loose. And Joseph sees his brothers and is unable to identify himself. George. Yep. Yeah, he let him dangle for a while, didn't he? Yeah, he's talking about how Joseph let them kind of fry in their own grief, so to say. Thank you very much. Joey. I'll have to look at that. Thank you for that question.